Welcome to everyone. We're so glad you're here. And we will start with the land acknowledgement. The 21 municipalities of Addison County sit on land that belongs to the Western Abenaki, the traditional caretakers of these Vermont lands and waters, which they call Endakina, or homeland. The land has served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. We remember their connection to this region and the hardships they continue to endure. We give thanks for the opportunity to share in the bounty of this place and to protect it. We are all one in the sacred web of life that connects people, animals, plants, air, water, and earth. And tonight's event is part of the Pollinator Pathway of Addison County ongoing education series to help us all learn more about what we can do for pollinators and our planet by planting native plants, removing invasives, rethinking our lawns, and not using pesticides or herbicides. We are all volunteers working together in our community, one plant and garden at a time. Come and join us. And we are fortunate to have as our speaker this evening, Emily May, who lives locally, we're even luckier for that. She is a conservation biologist at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. She became interested in pollinators as an undergrad at Middlebury College, studying biology and environmental studies, and planted a pollinator garden on campus, still outside by Hall over a decade later. Emily received a master's degree in entomology from Michigan State, where she studied pollinator habitat restoration, ground nesting bee ecology, which all of us have been wondering about, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Tonight, she'll take us into the enchanting world of fireflies to explore the secret lives of these captivating creatures, along with the role that fireflies and other nocturnal insects play in our ecosystems and how we can help them by lessening light pollution. Please help me welcome Emily.
Great. Thanks everyone for being here. This is really well timed because a week or so ago, the fireflies started popping out, and last night they put on an amazing show. So you will have an amazing show to look forward to later tonight when you head home. I'm excited to give this talk. It's the first time that I've given this talk, so I hope you enjoy it. I usually talk about pollinators, and the Pollinator Pathway invited me here to talk about fireflies, which are not traditional pollinators. If you're not familiar with my organization, the Xerces Society, we were founded in 1971 as a butterfly society. We're named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which was the first butterfly species known to go extinct through human activities in the US. And we now work on all invertebrate conservation. So working to conserve pollinators, but also the other species like freshwater mussels and butterflies and other snails, things that have no backbone, but that can contribute greatly to our ecosystems and to our crop systems. All of these animals provide really important services to us and to ecosystems. They provide pest control, they provide decomposition, nutrient cycling, keeping pests in check, serving as food for other animals. Invertebrates make up 95% of the world's animal biodiversity. And many of these ecosystem services provided by insects actually happen at night. So I talk a lot about pollinators. There's a lot of pollination that happens during the day, but almost 60% of invertebrates are active at night. And actually there's a lot more insect activity at night, which is something that you might recognize from starting to take a drive at dusk and seeing more insects hit your windshield. Predatory invertebrates, including spiders and ground beetles and lacewings, are very active at night. They do their hunting at night. So these are some of the amazing invertebrates. And I'm sorry for those of you in the back. I hope you'll be able to see some of the images here. We have a hawk moth and a lacewing larvae attacking an aphid up here. A ground beetle that is feeding on a spongy moth caterpillar. And this is actually a moth that is pollinating apples. So moths are a big contributor to pollination of rubus and apple species. So things like plums and pears and blackberries, those open flowers get visited by moths at night, and they do a lot of the pollination work for those species, which you might not have realized. We are biased in what we see because we go to bed at night, and so there's a lot of things that happen after dark. So nocturnal insects are important for crops. I'm going to just talk a little bit more about night active insects, and then we'll get into the meat of fireflies. But I just think it's really neat because we're starting to learn more about how important these insects are for pollination of crops and wildflowers. So there's some moth behaviors too that actually make them super important pollinators at night. Some moths will shake themselves to warm themselves back up at night, and so when they do that on a flower, more of the pollen gets on their bodies. It's almost like buzz pollination, if you've heard of that from bumblebees. So moths do that too to warm back up. And they also travel quite far, so they're important for gene flow of species. They contribute a lot to these wild plant systems as well. There are flies and beetles and other insects active at night moving around from flower to flower that are also contributing to plant pollinator networks. So I'll give another talk about nocturnal pollinators at some point, but this talk is mostly about fireflies. And the thing that brings them together is that artificial lighting is among the threats to these nocturnal insects. So more than half of the United States experiences light pollution, and it's a growing acreage every year that's affected by light pollution. It affects navigation of these insects, their ability to reproduce and find mates, their ability to find food. And so we'll talk more about this and solutions towards the end of this talk. But this was advertised as a firefly talk, and they are the stars of the show, the jewels of the night. So let's talk about fireflies. And please, I am encouraging you to ask questions. If you have questions about nocturnal insects and nocturnal pollinators at the end of the talk, I'm happy to take those too. So let's start at the beginning. Fireflies, what are they? They're not flies, they're beetles. They are members of the incredibly diverse beetle order in the firefly family, which is Lampyridae. So we don't know exactly how many species of firefly there are in the world, but the most recent numbers are about 175 described species in the US and more than 2,400 globally. They're most diverse in the tropics and get less diverse as you go north in latitude. There's at least 12 species in Vermont, probably more than that. They're just not that well described. There's not that many people that are going out and actually identifying fireflies to species out here. So I would guess that there's at least 15, maybe 20 species in Vermont, but we haven't gotten the range maps totally worked out. There's a threatened species found in New York and several others throughout the East Coast. Florida has quite a few threatened firefly species. We'll talk more about threats to fireflies, but in general, the species that we know we have here in Vermont are relatively stable, probably declining, but more stable than some of the other species found elsewhere, especially on coasts where there's sea level rise threatening their habitat. Fireflies can be organized into three main groups based on their adult courtship behavior. There are flashing fireflies, which are really the stars of the show. We have both flashing and daytime dark species here in Vermont. So flashing ones are the ones that you're most familiar with. They're the ones that light up at night. The males are using lights to talk to the females. The females use their lights to say, I'm here. And they're active from dusk into the night. Daytime dark species are less well known, but there are species that have basically lost their ability to communicate as adults with light, and instead they're using chemicals to do that. So there are species, the one in the middle there is a daytime dark species. It has really large antennae and smaller eyes, so it's active during the daytime, and it's using chemical communication instead of light. Fireflies this is the thing that they all share is that most larvae still have the ability to use light. So they're generating this light through a chemical reaction in their body between chemicals and this ATP energy molecule to generate the light. The third type of firefly is glowworms. We don't have any glowworm species here in Vermont. In those species, this is kind of like, if you remember James and the Giant Peach, there was a glowworm in that story, and that's what this is. So the adult females look like larvae, and they still have that light organ that they're using to communicate to the males. They don't have wings, they don't fly, they walk around and they signal to males, and the males come in and find them. So this is the most typical kind of firefly that you'll find in Europe, or also in the arid western United States, or parts of the southeast. But what we have up here are flashing species and daytime dark species. So this is going to be a little bit hard for folks in the back to see, but I wanted to talk about life cycle because that's important for understanding the biology of any insect. So let's start sort of towards the egg. All three groups of fireflies have similar life cycles that mostly differ in their adult stage. So just like other kinds of beetles, fireflies undergo complete metamorphosis, which means they go from an egg to a larva to a pupa to an adult. So in general, most fireflies spend most of their lives as larvae. They can spend up to 2 years as larvae and have multiple larval stages as they grow. So they'll start as an egg, they'll move into a larval stage where they're the big hunters, they're predators as larvae. We'll talk more about what they eat, but it's things like slugs and snails and worms. And then they'll pupate, usually in the soil surface. So about right under the soil surface to an inch or two below the soil surface, sometimes kind of together or sometimes just by themselves. Then they move into adult stage after they've pupated, and they'll mate, and then they'll lay eggs. So the exciting, the flashy time for these fireflies is that sort of short adult phase, but they spend most of their lives as larvae. So what do they eat? Firefly larvae, they're pretty armored looking, right? They're very predatory hunter animals. They're carnivores. They eat soft-bodied invertebrates like snails and slugs and earthworms, and then they inject prey with a numbing chemical to disable it. So they're not something that you would want to encounter if you were a soft-bodied invertebrate. And when they get hit adulthood, most of them don't eat. So they've done their time, they've put in the work, they've eaten what they need to, and all they want to do at that point is reproduce. So most of them don't eat. Some of them will feed on a little bit of nectar and pollen. So you will see them going to flowers from time to time to kind of get a quick hit of energy. And then there's the Photurus females. These are the femme fatale Photurus females. You can try saying that 5 times fast. These females will lure and eat males of other species. So we have a few of these species in Vermont. They're about 1 inch long, so they're twice as long as some of the other females of other species. And they will basically use what's called aggressive mimicry. So they mimic the lights of other species. So as the males are flashing, the females will respond. This is how the flash dialogue happens in general. The males will flash, the females will respond, the males are like, ah. The females will flash again. And so the Photurus females will mimic the flashes of other females from other species. And then when the male comes in, she'll devour his insides. So this is a Photurus female right here. Those are her mouth parts for eating other males. So more than 3/4 of fireflies in the US are nocturnal or crepuscular, which is a word meaning they're active at dusk. They're the twilight zone insects. So we have insects that are sort of active all the way around the clock, and fireflies usually are falling into that dusk time through a few hours after dark. They're using this light of their own making to communicate. The lights are used for a variety of different kinds of communication. So most fireflies, regardless of whether they're dark or light producing as adults, will be telling predators not to eat them as larvae with their light. So they'll be using light as a larvae, saying, I taste bad, It's kind of like the monarch butterfly has bright coloration to say, don't eat me. So the fireflies that light up as adults, however, have kind of this interesting pattern. They have different colors, sometimes by species, and sometimes actually by the time of night when they're lighting up. So some of them are sort of yellow-green, and some of them are kind of green-yellow, and then there's a few species that light up orange. But at dusk, it's more common to see the yellow flashes, which tend to stand out more against the greenish light that's reflecting off of leaves. And then as you proceed into the night, it gets more green. So even within the same species, they'll start to go more green over time. The other thing to know about flashing is the flash pattern. So this is a way that scientists can use to distinguish flashing one species from another. So if you're going out hunting or surveying for fireflies, what you're looking for is flash pattern. And so different species are going to have different flash patterns, and those are characterized by specific timing. So it's kind of like Morse code. Like you could have dot, 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 and then a long one, or dot, 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 and then a rising. So sometimes males of some species will rise up as part of their flashing. But yes, male courtship patterns tend to be pretty consistent in a way that's useful for identifying species. So these are the flash patterns of male cypress fireflies. And this is what a researcher trying to account for their flash pattern would write down on his data sheet for what kind of flashing they're seeing. So it goes dot, 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 long. And so you keep your timer out and you count the number of flashes and you record it on the data sheet. And then this is another example. These are Big Dipper fireflies in Kentucky. So they have these long upward rising flashes repeated every 6 seconds or so. And so I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's 1 second, there's an upward rise, and then there's a pause of 4 seconds, and then there's another upward rise in the flash. And so that's how they would go out and record what species they'd found. So how many of you have heard about synchronous fireflies? Not many. Oh man. Okay, well, they're really cool. There are only 3 species of synchronous fireflies in North America, and there's none found in Vermont, unfortunately. But maybe that's a good thing because we already get enough tourists. But you can be a firefly tourist in North Carolina or Tennessee, where we get these amazing displays of simultaneously flashing fireflies in the month of mid-May to mid-June. There's these Great Smoky National Park, and then there's another national park that have these species. And what happens is they'll emit a burst of a quick few flashes, and then they'll go quiet for maybe 12 seconds, and then they'll all flash again. And so originally, scientists thought that they all had their own internal metronomes to say, this is when we're going to flash, and then this is when we're not going to flash. But they actually used really careful video and mathematical modeling to figure out that individual fireflies of these species don't have any rhythm of their own. And it's all generated by a collective. So it's almost like a superorganism where the synchronized beat only emerges when many fireflies are gathered together in the same place. And so a burst of flashes will start in one place and then ripple out to the entire population that's there. So if they start off out of sync, a collective beat eventually emerges as they tune in to the other ones that are within eyesight. So definitely recommend going to be a firefly tourist at some point in the future. Gatlinburg, Tennessee gets a ton of people descending onto it looking for fireflies. So let's also talk a little bit about daytime dark species. So this is one example of a daytime dark species, the winter firefly. Has anyone here heard about the winter firefly? Nope. This is so exciting. So these species are generally day active and have lost the ability to communicate with light. And so they're using these chemicals for communication. Again, they tend to have smaller eyes and larger antennae than the ones that are active at night who are using light. So in these species, the flash dialogue is initiated by the male and then responded to by the female in flashing species. With these, the chemical is produced by the female and then the male is responding to it when they're trying to find mates. So one of the species that we have here in Vermont is the winter firefly, which is an unusual one. Most fireflies spend the winter as larvae under the soil. And then this species, or in leaf litter or other places, rock crevices, that kind of thing, this species actually emerges as adults in the fall and then overwinters on the sides of trees or at the base of trees. And they tend to like large hardwood species. They really like oaks. They also like maples. And so they're among the first adults to emerge in the spring of any firefly species. That's why they're called the winter firefly. Some of them are active as early February or March. And so I imagine many of us were not familiar with this species, but do any of you produce maple syrup? Some of you, hang buckets, okay. Another common name for these is the sap bucket beetles, because they will be on the sides of these trees overwintering, and then they'll gather around the freeze cracks and other wounds on the trees and then flop into the buckets. So they're often found kind of as a pest of maple syrup production. And amazingly, he's not in this room, but we have actually one of the world's top experts on winter fireflies in Middlebury, Greg Pask at the college. And his students have been studying the evolutionary trajectory of how these fireflies lost their light. So he and his students were actually able to extract and identify the first pheromone and sensory neuron for any firefly with the winter firefly, kind of proving that these other daytime dark species are using chemicals to communicate. So I was hoping Greg would be here so I could direct winter firefly questions to him, but I would definitely look for events that he's holding on them. He often will do a maple syrup event in the spring and go to a maple syrup house and talk about sap bucket beetles. So that's all the cool ecology stuff, and I'm actually going to pause there and see if there's any sort of life cycle questions about fireflies. Yeah?
Just the time frame, how long eggs, how long larvae?
Yeah, I meant to mention that. So eggs, they're usually an egg, they're in the egg stage for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then they go to larval stage. They're in larval stage all the way through the winter, and then they pupate just before they come out as adults. So they'll stay as larvae for about 2 years. They'll even go a full season past when they started as larvae, go through a full year, and then overwinter and become adults that mate.
And then,
the adults stay out for maybe a few weeks, and then they're done.
And they're done.
Yeah. So they're not eating at the time. Most of the adults aren't eating, so they really have kind of a short time frame where mating can even happen. Yeah.
When the firefly flashes, how can I say this? Is it intentional in the sense that the firefly flashes like, I'm going to flash? I mean, does it just happen? How does that work?
I'm not an insect neurobiologist, so I'm not exactly sure. I'm assuming they have some control, but that it's generated by the signals from their environment too. That they know that they're going to come out at a certain time of night, and that it's the conditions are right for me to start flashing now. And so the males will start the flashing process, and then the females will respond to it. And oftentimes they're seeking these perching sites. Both the males and the females are seeking perching sites. The females are sitting up on a perching site, and the males are flying around looking for females on a perching site. So you'll see them on the tops of tall grasses or on trees and shrubs. Yeah.
So the females don't fly, is that right?
The females do, so different species have some flightless females. It depends, but most of the species we have in Vermont have flight females. Females can fly as well as males. But like the glowworms, for example, are all flightless females. And some of the daytime dark females also don't fly.
So the chemical signaling, have they deciphered that?
So Greg Pask at the college was the first one to decipher a chemical signal from a firefly, and that was from the winter firefly.
But the chemical itself?
And they extracted the chemical itself and identified that exact pheromone.
Used it in any of the applications?
So I think one of the applications, to repeat the question was about the pheromones, the chemicals extracted from the fireflies, and if they have any other applications. So Greg isolated that pheromone from the winter firefly, and tested it on males and saw that the males were attracted to it. So I think the next step would be trapping potentially for winter fireflies, because they are somewhat of a pest of maple syrup production. Trapping for those species. I'm not sure exactly where he's taking it next, but that's something that comes to mind with pheromones.
Do male and female flash differently?
The question is, do male and females flash differently? And yes, they do. So the males are the ones that have the really species-specific courtship display, and so they have the blink, 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 long flash, that kind of thing. The females sometimes are just flashing continuously to say, hello, I'm here. Sometimes they'll have a pause. The male will do his display, the female will see it, and then she'll blink on. It depends on the species, but it is usually different.
I was wondering if, like, before you see them out flashing, you see what I used to call glowworms down in the grass on the ground, and they are like little larval things. Are those fireflies? So I'll just give you the series of questions. You can take them all. And then, is the light chemical, is it toxic? And are there predators for fireflies?
So there's multiple questions here. One is about seeing glowing larvae down near the ground. Those are fireflies. So larvae will light up, sometimes quite continuously, down near the soil surface where they're hunting to say, don't eat me. The chemical, I think, is called something like luciferase, I think is the name of the chemical that lights up, that produces the bioluminescence. And it originally, I believe, was sort of a toxic chemical in and of itself. So, but I'm stepping beyond what I actually know. So I think there's other things that they produce, like the numbing chemical, that are toxic. So it may not be the actual chemical from the flashing that's toxic in itself. So fireflies do have toxic chemicals. They're not great to eat for everything. They do taste bad. But they do have predators. There are a variety of things that we'll eat that are just generalists and are pretty immune to a lot of the defenses that insects put up. Spiders are one example. Any other questions? Oh, one in the back? Yeah.
So I'm not clear, are they pollinators then or not? I mean, they're not.
They're not pollinators. That's maybe the best I can do. So there's some species that as adults will move around to flowers to get some nectar to keep them going, but they're not actively moving pollen around. So at best it's going to be accidental and by a few, of the adults that are either going to flowers for nectar and pollen to just get something to eat, or they're perching on flowers that are at the top of a plant, and then they perch and then they move around. So at best, they're going to be accidental pollinators. They're not going to be big pollinators.
Their main focus is reproduction, huh?
Yeah, their main focus, their only focus as adults is talking to each other and reproducing.
Why can't people do that?
Yeah.
So, sorry I came in late, so if you covered this, but once they mate, will they then die, or are they just around for many, many, many nights trying to mate?
Once they have mated, they are really done. At least the males. Once they've mated a couple, they're trying for at least one time. The females stick around long enough to lay the eggs, and then their life cycle is over.
I just was wondering, because I asked the pollinator question then, would you describe them though as beneficial aside from obviously their beauty? But is there some other, is it because as larvae they're eating the snails? I don't know.
Yeah, so I would call them beneficial. They're providing pest control, right? They're keeping snails and slugs and earthworms and other things under control. So in areas where you've got that kind of a moist habitat, you've got a ton of slugs and snails, you want firefly larvae around to also take care of those. So, is it okay if I move on? Oh yeah.
I have an important question from our last presentation. Do they eat jumping worms?
The question is, do they eat jumping worms? That's a great question. I don't have the answer to it now. From what I understand, some things that eat other kinds of worms don't like to eat jumping worms. But I'm hoping that we'll find out that firefly larvae also eat jumping worms. That would be cool. Okay, So fireflies are treasured. They're treasured animals because they bring us this magic at night. We've got a whole room full of people talking about fireflies. But unfortunately, like many other kinds of insects, they are facing threats and in general declining. So we don't have a lot of long-term monitoring data, but we do have some concerning information. So the International Union of Conservation of Nature does these assessments of different species for the threats they're facing, and are they in general declining, what's their status. And it looked at North American fireflies and found that 1 in 3 of the species that it assessed may be at risk of extinction. A lot of these are species that have very restricted habitats. They're things that live in marshes near the coast. They live in places where either they're threatened by climate change in terms of drought and loss of water supply, or from actually the opposite, from sea level rise and loss of freshwater habitat. But surprisingly, fireflies really receive very little conservation attention in general. So we have a lot of wildlife dollars that flow to other areas, but fireflies don't have that many people speaking to them and working on their conservation. So there's an urgent need for more research to understand how their populations are doing. In general, some of the things they face are similar to what other species face: the loss of their habitat. This tiny little picture here is actually the development of a wetland habitat for housing near a beach. In the beach that I used to go to as a kid, Bethany Beach. There's a Bethany Beach firefly with a very restricted habitat, and this developer decided to build houses right over it by putting basically a boardwalk that cars could drive on, so they could put the houses on stilts over the wetland. So most firefly species are really dependent on moist habitats. They need wetlands and streams and damp fields, which we have a lot of here in Addison County. But modification of those habitats, when we drain them out, when we channelize them into irrigation ditches, that can negatively affect the fireflies that are looking for moisture. Residential development is another one that has threatened some of these species. Light pollution is something we're also going to talk about. It's a serious threat to dusk and night active flashing species, which is about 3/4 of all fireflies. And artificial light from street lamps and houses really affects the ability of these species to find their mates. So it affects their ability to navigate, it affects their ability to find mates and ward off predators. Climate change, and especially drought, disruption of natural water cycles and water flows, and sea level rise all pose threats. And then finally, pesticide use. There's very little direct research on fireflies and pesticides, but there is some on earthworms and some of the other prey species that fireflies require. And so there's definitely effects of pesticides. Larvae and the flightless females are likely the most vulnerable because they just have to stay in place. So they can't disperse away from areas that have been treated. But the good news is that you can help, and there are many things that we can do to help protect fireflies. It starts with understanding what they need. So I'm going to talk through the things you might not be able to read, but fireflies need habitat that are safe from pesticides that provide them with a few things. They need moisture to prevent the desiccation of fireflies and their prey. They need food, so that's things like snails and slugs and earthworms. That's especially critical in the larval stage. They need shelter, which is things like leaf litter and rocks, rotting logs, native vegetation at all life stages, because fireflies are here year-round and not just for the mating frenzy of June. And then they need dark nights, because many of these species are active at night and they use light to communicate. So what can you do to help fireflies? So some of the simple things we can do tend to be things that actually make our lives easier. So like leaving the leaves instead of cleaning them up. Leaf litter provides important shelter not just for fireflies, but also many other species: bees, butterflies, snails. Leaf litter also helps improve soil moisture and soil moisture retention, which is important for that microhabitat that fireflies are using. So refraining from raking and blowing leaves and shredding leaves as much as possible, moving leaves under your beds and using those in place of wood mulch. Those are things that could help with fireflies. Mowing practices also affect fireflies. Mower blades and the ground trampling that comes with mowing equipment can also directly kill fireflies. Larvae and the females spend most of their time on the ground. Males can also be found, using grasses and forbs as resting places during the day. So if you do have to mow, consider setting your mower blades higher to leave a buffer between the fireflies that are at the surface and the blade, or mow when fireflies are least active, which is like the dormant period through the fall and winter. Unmown habitat can be really helpful for a variety of other beneficial insects and wildlife. For those of you managing meadows, so if you have like a wet meadow that you're brush hogging to keep woodies out, do this on a rotational mowing basis. So only doing maybe a third of the area each year, and then leaving some of it to be undisturbed refuge where fireflies and other wildlife can be. This is the same thing you would hear about grassland birds, rotational brush hogging. Planting native is also something that helps fireflies and many other kinds of wildlife. Grasses and forbs provide shelter and perching places. They can also provide food sources. Tall grasses provide cover for larvae and their prey, and also give females a better vantage point for watching males flash. Although most adult fireflies don't feed, there are the reports of adult males in particular visiting aster and goldenrod and milkweed as some of the examples. And then shrubs and trees are also providing shelter and perches, and trees can be used to help block light pollution, which we'll talk more about. They also increase the diversity of vegetation heights, so some species might like to be a little bit higher up than others. Different species will signal from different heights, so having a range of perching heights can help. And then planting diverse native species, I said this wasn't a nocturnal pollinator talk, but planting a diversity of native species helps increase diversity of the insects visiting them. So if you have moths and other nocturnal pollinators, you likely have dozens, if not hundreds, of different kinds of night active insects in your yard. Planting diversity brings in diversity. And planting native where possible also helps. Fireflies, like lots of other wildlife, prefer areas that stay a little bit messy. So you can think about leaving downed logs and leaf litter. You can also think about allowing some areas of the yard to stay a little bit untidy, maybe adding some kind of water feature. I know there's a little bit of balance that has to happen there with mosquitoes. But if you already have moisture, then you probably have fireflies and mosquitoes. There's also other simple steps to take in terms of light pollution. So I want to talk through some of the features of outdoor lighting. Outdoor lighting in general disrupts nocturnal insects. It disrupts their rhythms, just like it can disrupt ours, even though we're day active animals. Their flight and navigation, their ability to mate and feed. So artificial lighting is a really significant threat to all kinds of night active species. So one thing that I recommend people do is actually just go out at night at their place and look and see what kind of light you see. Sometimes it takes a little while for your senses to kind of get used to it. And then you'll notice the splash of light coming from the house, or you'll notice the street light, or you'll notice the floodlight across the way. And you'll start to see maybe the sky glow from Middlebury. So it gives you kind of a starting point for understanding where light is coming from in your environment. One of the reasons that we talk about this is that firefly vision is different from ours. So we see light from the violet through red of the spectrum. Honeybees down here, these are diagrams showing the light spectrum and then where we actually respond to them in our vision. Honeybees are seeing UV light through yellow, so they're more on the UV side of the spectrum, the shorter wavelengths. Fireflies are pushed out to the other side of the spectrum. So they see a pretty narrow band. They see some UVs, and then they also see green through orange, the same kind of part of the spectrum that flashes are involved with. So you will sometimes hear that amber light is better for protecting insects at night. That's true for some other insects that don't respond as well to amber light, but amber filtered light is not necessarily better for fireflies because that's right in the middle of the spectrum that they see. So light intensity tends to be more important for fireflies. For fireflies, there's a variety of things that can happen when they encounter light pollution. When they move towards the light, at best it's a waste of time. At worst, maybe it's a fatal attraction and they don't make it to a mate. There's a reduced period of time for them to display, and then it can disrupt the communication, the back and forth that's happening between males and females. Flash less, respond less, fail to get in the mood. So we're in a much better place here with light pollution compared to a lot of the East Coast. This is a light pollution map showing Burlington to Rutland, though, and we do have some areas of light pollution at night. You can see Middlebury's light projecting out and up into the clouds, really from anywhere around the area. Bicentennial Hall, where I planted a pollinator garden, it's the largest window in the state of Vermont. It's a beautiful view in the daytime, but it's also an obvious point source of light pollution at night. And so Burlington and Rutland are of course worse, but there's still things we can be doing here in our community. Nighttime fireflies need dark nights, and so wherever possible, turning off the lights is the best step that we can take, actually turning them off. If there are lights that are needed, things like getting to your driveway, going down the sidewalk, wanting to be warned if someone's coming close to your house, motion detectors and timers are what I would recommend. If there's any lights, floodlights especially, that you can put on a timer as our motion detector rather than having them on permanently, that's going to be reducing light in both space and time, which is really important for fireflies and other night insects. So lots of things you can keep up most of the time, using a motion detector for when you need light for practical or safety purposes. And then closing shades inside the house. This is one that I think a lot of us don't think about until we take that exercise of going outside at night and looking at where the light is coming out into the yard and realizing, okay, maybe I need a curtain on that window that I'm in for a long time during the time that fireflies are active. Maybe I'm watching TV and the light is spilling out. So putting curtains on your windows in the rooms that you're active in until, late in the night. For the ones that you have to keep for whatever reason, shielding and hooding lighting, dimming it, and then also using potentially a red filter on bulbs. So there are red bulbs that are more firefly safe. That's not part of the spectrum that they see. You can also, for lights that you already have, there's a red filter. And so Dark Sky International is a great resource for looking for all of this kind of information. They have lots of reducing light pollution tips. The added benefit of all of these steps to reduce artificial lighting is that it makes it a lot easier to see the stars at night too, not just the fireflies. So again, with lighting, only where necessary and only when necessary. Thinking about shielding, placement, height, putting things on timers and motion detectors, and then using this red filtered light. This is an example from the Everglades where they've put a red filter on a campground bathroom to try and keep it from attracting lots of insects and disrupting their nights. And it has a good example of this downward and shielded lighting rather than light that spills up and out. Lighting standards that reduce light at night also protect birds. So most migratory birds actually fly at night, and building collisions are responsible for about 1 billion bird deaths every year. So these are, orioles and thrushes and sparrows and warblers and vireos. Skyscrapers and other big buildings that are lit up at night have the most sort of per building bird collisions, but individual residential buildings cumulatively kill the most birds. So overuse of lighting at night is something that we can be working on as individuals in our residences and also in the community level. This Lights Out Connecticut is an example of a group that was organizing from Connecticut Audubon to protect migratory birds. And they were able to get Connecticut to pass legislation last year to turn off non-essential outdoor lighting on state buildings between the hours of 11 and 6 a.m. to protect migratory birds. So this is one example of state legislation that can be used to help protect nighttime active wildlife. Minnesota, New York, Texas also have statewide Lights Out programs, and there are a variety of cities, DC, Atlanta, Baltimore, Chicago, that have similar programs. So we can look outside of Vermont for examples of this kind of policy. One thing that we also might think about, if I know there's a lot of gardeners in this room, so when we're trying to garden for wildlife in places with a lot of outdoor lighting we can't control, whether that's a neighbor with a floodlight or a street light, or maybe there's light that comes from your house, you can also work to create a dark zone in your garden with vegetation. So if you think about light kind of like a pollutant, like pesticide drift, you can protect your garden by planting trees and shrubs to try and block that light from coming into your space, creating a dark zone for hopefully a firefly to mate or some other insect to move around. Something to sort of move outside the box in creating a pollinator garden that's protected from pesticides and also from light drift. But speaking of pesticides, whenever possible, we're working on eliminating cosmetic pesticide use that is not necessary, looking for alternatives. So if pesticides are used, for example, in managing invasives with herbicides, we're looking to make that as targeted as possible and taking steps to minimize the impacts to firefly habitat and pollinator habitat. Remembering that pesticides have the potential to harm not just fireflies and their habitat, but also their prey, the food sources they rely on. On a similar note, I did want to specifically mention bug zappers, which are really not a good tool for controlling outdoor pest species. They're still manufactured and available despite overwhelming research that they are not good at killing the bugs that we want them to kill and very good at killing everything else. Out of 10,000 insects killed by one bug zapper in a test in Florida, only 8 were mosquitoes. And so most of them were harmless or beneficial insects like moths. And so some early research from Doug Tallamy in the 90s estimated that if you have 4 million bug zappers in use across the US, operating for 40 nights a year, that would kill an estimated 70 to 300 billion harmless or beneficial insects every year. So this is my plug, don't use bug zappers outdoors. I would say some folks use them indoors, which seems okay, but I would not use them outdoors. So I'm moving into the final stretch here, which is I'm going to talk a little bit about surveying for fireflies. But ultimately, in terms of conservation action, the best thing we can do is to leave things a little bit wild, leave things a little bit untidy, which I'm hoping all of you are doing anyway. I'm a lazy gardener. So your best plan of action is to embrace a diversity of microhabitats. This hypothetical scene is depicting some of the things that fireflies need: a diversity of different plant heights, canopy heights, leaf litter and underground burrows, tall grasses for perching, and trees with deeply furrowed bark for a species like the winter firefly that likes to crawl into the crevices. And then dark skies free of light pollution. So in this last section, I'll just talk about some of the community science efforts that we're leading at Xerces. So one other great way to contribute to conservation of fireflies is to help figure out where they are and how many of them there are. So there's a lot we still don't know about where different species occur. Like I said, we have at least 12 species in Vermont, but probably more. We don't know always when they're active and how abundant they are. So this is where community science can come in and help fill that gap. So we developed the Firefly Atlas, which is a collaborative effort to just create more data, collect more data on where fireflies occur, what habitat they're associated with, and when they come out, when are they active, especially for species that are data deficient. Anyone in the US and Canada can contribute to the Firefly Atlas by reporting an observation or actually going out and doing a full survey, which I took some slides out of here because they were even too intense for me. They involve time measurements and data sheets for the flashing patterns. But if you're into that, that's all on the Firefly Atlas website. We're tracking all species described from the US and Canada and currently prioritizing survey efforts in some of these areas. Vermont's not in there, but they're chosen based on having a high number of threatened species. So these are where some of the threatened firefly species are located in the southeast US and along the coast. And if you're not within a focal region, which is here, you can still use the species checklist and contribute data. It's just not one of the priority areas. The species checklist has a resource center for basically all of the different conservation needs and species profiles and tips for photographing fireflies and that kind of thing. So you can download a checklist of the 12 species that we know to occur in Vermont. So if you want to document a firefly, you can catch a firefly and take photos, doing your best with what you have. And also ideally after watching the flash pattern of that species. That's even better. So ideally you would catch the same individual whose flash pattern you just observed and wrote down on that little data chart. Catching fireflies takes some practice. They're pretty mobile. But if you have a net, that helps. You can swing it around and follow through to get it into the tip of the net and then try and get it out that way. Try and get photos as close up as your camera is able of both the front and the back side of the firefly. And oops, that's the dorsal side, the upper side, that's the underside. And then ideally, I'm just layering things that are ideal on top of each other here. You would also lay it on top of a ruler or some other form of measurement, because there are differences in species in between maybe half an inch up to an inch for some of these different ones. So you could put the firefly in a plastic bag and then lay it on a ruler, take a photo that way to just document how big it is. And then enter it onto the Firefly Atlas. So you just go onto the website and click record a sighting, and then you post the photo with the information. And it helps understand where fireflies are, when they came out, and what did you see. So that's it for me. We are a donor-supported nonprofit at Xerces Society. Members are what make it possible for me to be here today. Please visit our website. We have lots of downloadable resources on the Xerces website, including lots of firefly-specific resources. So we have sort of the state of the fireflies, conservation actions you can take, and then tons of other resources on other invertebrates, including pollinators. We've been around since the 70s, so some of these resources, we have decades of work of creating this type of library of resources. So what I want to just leave you with here is this, that one of the most simple things that you can do for fireflies is go spend that time outside at night enjoying them and appreciating them, watching them. You can bring a friend. I think that, if you're doing this with someone else in your community, you can really tap into the joy of the firefly experience even more. Bring your kids, if they're still awake. And then as you do that, as you observe fireflies, you're also going to be observing some of the things that interfere with your enjoyment of them, like the light that's flashing out from the house. So tonight is going to be a great night for watching fireflies. They are out. You'll probably start to see the first flashes a little after 9, maybe 9:15, and then they'll really be putting on a show by 9:30. So I'll take questions. Yeah.
Are they affected by the monthly cycles of moonlight?
Oh, that's a great question. The question is, are they affected by the monthly cycles of moonlight? And I would imagine that they are aware of and can perceive the difference between a moonless night and a full moon night. But I'm not sure exactly how it affects their activity. That's a great question. There's a different, light intensity differs by a factor of like 1 million from sun to full moon, and then it differs by another very small factor between full moon, and no moon. So I imagine they can perceive it, but I don't know what it does.
Do all 12 of the species come out at the same time, or is there a spread? There's an early one and a later one.
Yeah, so the question is about when do the different 12 species of Vermont come out, and there is a spread. So like I said, the winter firefly comes out starting in February, March. They don't mate until about April, May, so there's other species that will come out through early summer as adults for the mating frenzy. I would recommend checking out the species checklist on Firefly Atlas, because you can go and look at every single individual species, what it's associated with, what its flash looks like, and that can give you a lot more information. Yeah, in the back.
If you happen to discover a new species in Vermont while doing your Xerces research, do you get naming rights?
I'm not expecting to describe any new species from Vermont. I think what I would be expecting is to find the same species that we have in Massachusetts and New York. We have at least 24 species from Massachusetts that are known to be there from documented records. So I expect that we have more than 12 in Vermont. But I don't think I'm going to get any fireflies named after me. Love the sign, thank you.
I just wondered if temperature affects the amount of activity.
Yeah, so I think night active insects in general are a lot more responsive. They have kind of tighter windows of when they're active based on temperature. And so some of the reason that some insects actually probably come out at night is to avoid the heat of the day. So it's, I don't know that much about temperature in fireflies specifically, but I imagine that they are responsive to it, and it might be why they come out earlier in some years when it's hotter at night. Like tonight, it's going to be pretty warm at night, and then might be later on if there's a cool spring and cool nights. So they're definitely, all insects are responsive to temperature, and different ones have different kind of envelopes they're comfortable with.
There seems, just from my own experience, to fireflies just aren't around as much, just out and about. Is there data of how much they have disappeared in the last, let's say, 20 years? Is that trajectory increasing as climate change?
Yeah, the question is about how much documentation is there of the decline and observation that they're not around as much. So I think a lot of what we have is anecdotal observation that they're not around as much, and less actual long-term monitoring and data. So that's part of why the Firefly Atlas was started, was to try and collect that monitoring data, because we just don't have it for a lot of these species. But we know from a variety of different studies that in general insects are declining and insect biomass is declining, and that anecdotal evidence is supportive of that too, right? We all see fewer bugs on our windshield, and it's not just because they're more aerodynamic. There's just fewer bugs.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore what you said. Last night I went out and it was unbelievable. The stars were so clear, and the lightning, the fireflies were there, and the intermingling of the stars and the fireflies is sort of mind-blowing. But the other thing is I saw a firefly today that was clearly, deprived of water. So I think, because we're in a kind of a drought right now, so anything I think you can do on your leaf litter to just gently spray it. We are going to get some rain, I hope, but I think it's really hard on them. So just giving them some kind of water.
Yeah, that's a great point. Although we are supposed to get a week of 1 to 3 inches of rain starting Thursday. So it'll be good for the fireflies and the moisture. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if the advice you gave about the lighting applies pretty uniformly to all wildlife, or are there conflicts like the one that you mentioned with mosquitoes versus fireflies?
I think it applies pretty universally. The only difference, I think, is just in the spectrum of lighting that is sometimes recommended for other wildlife or for our own mammalian circadian rhythm. We benefit from moving from cool to warm in lighting. Fireflies benefit from us turning off the lights in general. And a lot of insects, I think, are going to be the same. Some of them will not be quite so disturbed by things that are on the warmer end of the spectrum, so amber into red, but in general, they're going to all respond positively to having less light in the night environment.
Do you know if birds can see red?
The question is, do birds see red? And I don't know the answer. Great question.
I'm curious, like how far fireflies move throughout their life cycle. Like if I see a firefly in my yard tonight, does that mean its whole life cycle was very close by, or do they get around?
So the females and the larvae don't move very far at all. The males can disperse a little bit farther, and I'm not sure how far they disperse, but generally that's how gene flow is going to happen in a firefly population, is the males are going to travel farther looking for females than the females are going to travel. You had asked about flightless females, or maybe someone in here had asked, Lily, you'd asked about flightless females. And females are just poorer flyers. Their wings are generally, even for the species that can fly, are much more, they're shorter than for the males. So males are better flyers in fireflies. and they're going to move farther. I don't have an exact distance for you. I wish I did. I'll look it up. Yeah.
I wondered if you had a good strategy for educating maybe neighbors with floodlights. I was thinking in particular, these lights with a little solar cell on them that are everywhere now. And of course, they just come on when people aren't home. Is there a pamphlet or something that you can do that's neighborly?
Yeah. So the question is about how to be neighborly in asking your neighbors to turn off their lights. And so there are pamphlets. Dark Sky is a great resource for some of this. Lights Out Connecticut, which is one of the groups I mentioned, developed a bunch of different pamphlets for different audiences about the importance of lighting practices for migratory birds. Most Vermonters are bird watchers and care about birds. So if that's something that your neighbor would be interested in talking about, you can come at it from a bird perspective or a firefly perspective. And then I think the other thing is just to organize with other folks who are interested in the same issue and demonstrate what that lighting practice can look like. If you have solar lights, those are some of the ones that I'd probably pull because you don't have the ability to put them on a detector or a timer. Same with the patio lights and the party lighting. I love it, but as a human, I want to be in party lighting, but on the other hand, most insects don't.
They don't party?
Not that way.
Yeah, you sort of answered my question, but I did wonder about the location, because of course last year I bought some little solar lights that are low to the ground that help me when I go out with my dog, and I'm also nervous about the bears and things like that. Where I am, it's very dark, and they just go out in a little star shape on the ground. But then now that I'm thinking about this, because I wasn't at the time I bought it, I didn't have this in my awareness, I'm thinking that's pretty bad for a lightning bug looking for its mate because it's on the ground. But is there a thing with location of lights? Like if they're on the building, it's just as bad, or is the grass really bad because that's where the
No, I think higher up is going to have a wider projection, so it's going to be affecting more area. You're probably taking away less mating area with a small solar light than you would be with a large light. So the more that those can be shielded, if you want to have that available for you as you go out, I think the questions to ask are just, is it necessary? When is it necessary? And what can I do to mitigate it? So putting it closer down to the ground in a very limited area is going to be a lot less of an impact than having something like a floodlight come on.
Is there a time, like in the summer, at which this will be passed? And I could, if I took them all up now, at least for fireflies.
For fireflies, the mating season is the most important. So if there's any time to be turning it off, it's when migrating birds are coming into the area, so May and then June. If you're going to remove your night lighting, May and June are the key months to do it in.
So I'm thinking about the timing of all these 12 or 12 plus species. And so if I'm out there in my yard, can I assume that there are many of these species already around doing that, or are some species coming out earlier in June and then a different species might come out the next week? What's the timing of that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely species overlap in when they come out, but it might be overlapping over the course of a month or so. So different species might come out for a smaller window within that time. But thinking about something like the Furturus femme fatale females, they're coming out at the same time as the species that they're preying on. So yeah, again, I would recommend checking out the species profiles, the different 12 species we have.
Do fireflies remain active all through the dark part?
Of the night?
Like all night?
So I think that's a good question. I think their activity is pretty concentrated towards the beginning of the night, but I'm not 100% sure. You think about when the flashing is occurring in your yard and it's probably not going all the way through the night. I'm not sure about some of those species though, because some different insect species are trying to take advantage of the full 24-hour clock and finding their kind of niche within it. So some nocturnal insects, for example, are very active right at dusk. Some are active in the dead of night, and then some are active more towards the morning as the light is starting to come back out. For fireflies, I'm not totally sure, but the ones that I'm familiar with tend to be active, in the first half of the night from dusk onward.
Emily, everything that you've told us tonight about fireflies and protecting them really applies to all nocturnal insects, including moths, which are big pollinators, right? That's kind of why we chose to have you here, because it's the same message. Is that correct?
Yeah, the comment question was about that gardening for fireflies is also gardening for other nocturnal insects, and that's true. So the same things that I think the difference being just that some of those other nocturnal insects really need other food sources. So where fireflies are eating slugs and snails and earthworms, moths and other nocturnal insects are actually going to need those nectar and pollen sources, especially nectar for a lot of the moth species. So that's where planting a diversity of native plants is really important for supporting the widest variety of night active insects that you can. Fireflies included, moths included, beetles and other flies included. All right, last question. How about that?
Oh my goodness. Do any of the Vermont fireflies have that rise up flash to them?
I believe so. But I'm not familiar enough. This was the first time I gave this talk, and I had to do a lot of digging around to figure out what to say. But no, I don't think I'm not familiar enough to know what those flash patterns look like. But I do plan on surveying my backyard, so maybe I can tell you next time I give this talk. Yeah.
I think this is the third time we've had Emily, either on a webinar or in person, and every time it's different, every time it's amazing. So thank you all for coming, and Emily, thank you so much for being here. If you look under that chair, I have a little something for you. You can, there actually is something in there, it's very light, but there's seeds that we've collected of native plants from around here, so you can continue your garden. Emily says that every year she enlarges her garden a little bit with seeds that she collected from her own flowers, so now you can add some to it. So I have a few announcements. First of all, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Fran Putnam. I'm one of the Pollinator Pathway of Addison County steering committee members. We have some handouts on the table as you go out, and you're welcome to take them. And if there's some books there and so on, and one way to remember them is to use your cell phone, if you have one, and take a picture. This is our last presentation for the summer. We'll probably be picking up something in the fall. I just wanted you to know that National Pollinator Week is July 17th to 22nd, and there are some events. You could look for our display at the National Bank of Middlebury as you walk by there. And I also have this Pollinator Celebration Day, which is, let's see, it is Saturday, oh thanks. Saturday, June 22nd, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the UVM Hort Farm in South Burlington. And this will be at the back table, so you can take a picture of it. There's a keynote presentations, native plant bazaar, and pollinator expo, and then workshops. Are you doing something there? Yeah, I thought so. And Pollinator Pathway, PPAC, will have a table there. So there's that. And look around and see, there might be some other things, other events going on. These are the ones I know about. And then finally, I want to talk about H706, the Pollinator Protection Bill. A lot of you have been receiving our emails and action updates, and thank you so much for taking part in this important project to get neonicotinoids out of our agricultural and our agricultural lawns and all the different places where it's used, and it's so toxic to the insects that we're trying to save. So right now, that bill passed the House and the Senate, was sent to the governor. He vetoed that bill. He vetoed it on, what was that date? It was
World Bee Day.
World Bee Day, yes, he vetoed on World Bee Day. So now it's coming back to the legislature on the first day of National Pollinator Week. And we're hoping for an override. So if you're interested in this topic, you could let your legislators know, both House and Senate, Vermont House and Senate, and just say, I support H706, the Pollinator Protection Bill. And we're hoping for a veto override, and then this will start to go into effect. And a lot of people here, how many of you have worked on this bill or know about it? All right, see, our action alerts are working. I think that's it for me. Bethan, do you have anything else? Are we all set? Okay, thank you again for coming. We appreciate it. There's a donation jar at the back. We use that to defray our expenses for things like posters and the use of this building. And, oh, I knew I forgot something. I wanted to thank the Middlebury Congregational Church for the use of this building and at a very reasonable cost. So thanks again for coming, and have a look at our handouts.